Hello, everyone. Welcome to this month's Sustainability Forum, and happy Valentine's Day. Thank you for spending some of your time with us. We really appreciate it, and I hope that you're looking forward to the presentation as much as I am. I wanted to point out a few things before we get started. On your table, you'll notice a triangular form. It mentions questions. So if you have any questions during the conversation that we're going to have, you can enter them on pollev.com, following the instructions on your card. You can also text it in if you don't have a computer and rather text, and you can follow the directions again on your card. Those can also be submitted all the way through until we have questions, in which point you can continue to ask them, but we'll be following a list, so get them in early. The second thing that's on your table is a flyer for our March forum. It's on our waste system revitalization. That's on March 7th. So if you want to RSVP, the link's open, and you're welcome to do so at any time. I should introduce myself. I am Christina Noonan. I am the Communications Coordinator for the Sustainability Office. And I'd like to also introduce Arlen Moeller. He's the Associate Professor for the Psych Department here at IIT. He'll be moderating for our speaker, Tim Kasser. And Tim Kasser is an author who can probably get a larger introduction from Arlen. But in any case, he has a book that's available at the IIT bookstore if you're interested on the topic or you're especially moved by the forum today. I think it's about $13.95. You'll have to double check those numbers. But it's available in front of the bookstore if you're interested in the MTCC afterwards. I see it out there in the audience already. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Christine. It's really an honor and a privilege for me to be introducing today's speaker, Professor Tim Kasser from nearby Knox College. Tim earned his bachelor's degree at Vanderbilt University and his PhD at the University of Rochester, where I also attended. He is a prolific scholar of social psychology. He's published over 50 peer-reviewed journal articles, 5 books, one of which, as Christine said, is in our bookstore. He also appears in the 2011 documentary Happy, which some of you may have seen. It's available on Netflix if you haven't. I recommend it. Tim's also served as an editor for a number of prestigious psychology journals, including a tenure at the Journal of Social and Personality and Social Psychology, which is widely considered the flagship, most prestigious journal in that area. Especially impressive about Tim's work has to do with the fact that his contributions are made not only at the theoretical or applied level, but he's one of the rare researchers whose work makes contributions at both a theoretical and applied level, and he lives a lifestyle that's consistent with his work in many respects, and I admire that very much. So I hope you'll join me in offering Tim a warm IIT welcome.
Well, thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I really am looking forward to the opportunity of sharing some of the ideas that my colleagues and I have been putting forth over the last few years. And so I want to just start by talking a little bit about some of the ecological crises we face. We know well that there are many problems which are going on in the contemporary world. We have massive amounts of different kinds of pollutants going into the air, which is leading to global climate disruption and all kinds of other sorts of difficulties. We have pollution that ends up affecting other species, like with oil spills. And we also have massive biodiversity loss. You maybe can't see this, but this is a picture of a denuded field where basically almost nothing can live. Okay? And increasingly what we have are a variety of different issues. I mean, carbon and climate change are at the top of many people's minds, but let's not forget all of the other difficulties that are facing humans right now and other species right now as well. Now, environmentalists and politicians and people of many different ilk have worked very hard and have made a lot of successes in terms of trying to meet some of these environmental challenges. But really, when you think about the scale of what we face and how far we've come, we really are falling far short of what ultimately is going to be necessary in order to ensure a good, sustainable life for your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren, other species, etc. And so, and part of this has to do with a variety of different kinds of problems with regard to how people tend to respond. Whoop. See, I was looking at you all. Has to do with how people tend to respond to the different things that environmentalists have attempted to do over the years to lead to a more sustainable world. So, one of the things that many of us have done has been a large amount of scientific research in order to document the variety of problems which exist out there with regard to sustainability. But by and large, a lot of this is met with either public denial, oh no, there is no climate change. If there is climate change, it's not due to humans. Or apathy. Well, I'm more interested in the Super Bowl than I am in climate change, and so let me focus on those kinds of issues instead. We also have, increasingly been told, well, if we make simple behavior changes, if we, turn off the faucet while we're brushing our teeth, or if we change our light bulbs, that will solve the problem. Well, it's worthwhile, don't get me wrong, to make these kinds of changes, but by and large, what the research shows is that there's fairly little evidence of what's called spillover. So a lot of why people think that these simple behavior changes will be worthwhile is that if people start turning off the water when they're brushing their teeth, then they're also going to want to buy a hybrid car, and they're also going to want to vote for politicians who support realistic climate change action. And in fact, that's just not happened, okay? There's no evidence that these little small behaviors end up turning into big behaviors on the part of individuals. In fact, there's some evidence that the opposite can happen, that if you go and buy a hybrid car and you save some money and you feel like you've done something good for the environment, then you feel more free and you have a little bit more money to go fly to Bermuda for vacation. It's called the rebound effect. So another thing that people have tried, if individual behavior change doesn't work and scientific research doesn't work, well then let's try some top-down changes. We'll just make everybody behave in more sustainable ways by passing laws or making policies. But as we all know, that hasn't worked so well either, because really there isn't very high public demand for a lot of these policies, and there's enormous institutional resistance to a lot of these policies as well, in part because of our campaign finance laws, which make the politicians in charge of these laws largely beholden to big corporations who oftentimes don't want these kinds of changes. So we've got a variety of different attempts, some of which have had some successes, don't get me wrong. But in terms of really reaching the level that's necessary in order to confront these problems head on, they have not worked so well. Now, I by no means suggest that what I'm going to present to you today is the panacea or the solution to all of these issues. But I think it's another element that, by and large, environmentalists have not paid as much attention to. And I think that the work that we've done over the years suggests some ways that environmentalists might set about doing their work a little bit differently. And I want to begin by acknowledging my colleague Tom Crompton. Tom works for the World Wildlife Fund in the UK. That's the panda people. He and I first met back in, I think it was 2007. And he got WWF to commission me to work with him. He has the best job title in the world. He's a change strategist. And tries to figure out how to help people change. And so we started working together in order to talk about how to apply some psychological research in order to make environmental campaigns and communications more effective. And we started focusing on the issue of human identity, how people think of themselves, who people actually are. And one of the reasons this is really important is because we know from a lot of research that if information that a person receives is inconsistent with their human identity, it just bounces off of them. Okay, so if I tell you something that just doesn't fit your conception of yourself or the world, it's like I did in one ear out the other, as they say. Okay, whereas if you tell people information which is identity consistent, then they pay attention to it. Furthermore, we know that human identity is very relevant to people's specific behaviors that they engage in, okay? And obviously we all need to have different behaviors with regard to sustainability. And furthermore, our identity is very important for influencing our political actions, both with regard to voting and protests and all of this. So we decided that, well, let's see if we can understand more about human identity as it's related to sustainability-related issues. And we wrote a little book called Meeting Environmental Challenges, The Role of Human Identity, which focused on 3 different aspects of identity. The first was group identity, so how we think of ourselves vis-a-vis others, and especially vis-a-vis nature. Coping strategies, how do we actually cope with the problems that come on environmentally? Do we blame China and India instead of looking at our own behavior, or do we look at our own behavior? And values and goals. And values and goals are what I'm going to dig into today for the talk. So what are values and goals? Well, from a psychological perspective, what values and goals are, they're guiding principles in life. They're the ideas that we have that help tell us what to do with our lives, what's important to us, what we're striving to do, what we want to make happen, what we want to prioritize. And we know from the research that values and goals affect our attitudes towards the world. So, for example, if you're a person who really cares a whole lot about money, and I show you Forbes magazine or Inc. magazine, you're probably going to say, oh, let me see that. Okay, you're going to have a positive attitude towards that magazine because it's something that fits with your values. On the other hand, if you don't really care about making money, that you're going to have a negative attitude perhaps towards that magazine. Similarly, with regard to policies, we know that, for example, if you care a lot about money, you'll tend to favor tax policies that keep as much money in your pocket instead of going to the government, okay? You'll have a positive attitude towards that as opposed to other policies you might have. We also know that values and goals influence our likelihood of engaging in different behaviors. So Friday at 4 o'clock, all things being equal, whether or not I stay in my office and crank out another paper or a grant proposal, or I go home and I play with my kids, is a function and part of my values. Okay, it's a function and part of what I think is important in life. And the fact is I can't do both. At 4:02, I can't both be writing and playing with my kids. And so our values influence our behaviors. Now, it might seem like there are an innumerable number of values and goals which we might pursue in life, but what the research actually shows is that there's around a dozen basic types of values and goals which emerge when you do research on people's values and goals cross-culturally. And one of the most important things that I hope you get out of this talk today is that values and goals are organized in systems. So to talk about any one value or goal in and of itself, like to say that I value the environment, in and of itself, that's actually a fairly meaningless statement from a value and goal perspective, because your valuing of the environment sits in a whole broader set of systems of other things you do or do not value. And we'll talk about this in a lot of detail as we go forth here. Now, what I'm about to show you here are 2 different models of how values and goals tend to be organized in people's minds. And I want to begin by emphasizing that both of these models have been validated in numerous nations around the world. The first model in actually over 70 different nations. The second model in fewer than that, but still a good number. And what these are called are circumplex models. And you'll see that they're in shapes of circles. And you're going to see that the values are organized along a circle. And values which are next to each other are values which are compatible with each other. That is, that are relatively easy to simultaneously pursue. But values which are on opposite side of the circumplex are in conflict with each other. So let me show you the first circumplex. And I want to re-emphasize, these are not theoretical models. This is not something some psychologist sat at his desk one day and thought, oh, this is how values are organized. These are models which are based on literally the collection of data from tens of thousands of people in dozens of nations around the world. Now, this is the first and most famous circumplex. Can people in the back see it okay? Yep, okay. So this is the circumplex of Shalom-Schwartz. And there's a lot of information on both of these circumplexes, or circumplexi. And I'm not going to ask you to look at them all. I'm just going to focus on a couple of things. So I just turned some of these values down in the southwest corner of the circumplex red. These are what are called the self-enhancement values for achievement and for power. Okay? And here are some of the specific items which Schwartz uses to assess self-enhancing values. So what you can see is that these are values which concern having power, seeming like you're good in other people's eyes, having wealth, being successful, influential, etc. And the fact that achievement is next to power in this circumplex suggests that it's relatively easy to simultaneously pursue achievement and power. And when you think about that, that makes sense, right? I'm trying to achieve, and as I achieve more and more, oftentimes that puts me in position of power. And in order to have power, I usually have to achieve a fair bit. Okay? This is how people think about their values. Now, these values of self-enhancement stand in contrast to the values on the northeast part of the circumplex, which are called the self-transcendence values of universalism and of benevolence. Here are some of the specific items which are used to assess self-transcendent items. So what these concern is trying to help other people, be connected with other people, help the broader world be a better place. And the fact that they're on opposite sides of the circumplex suggests that most people experience the pursuit of self-enhancing values as being in relative conflict with the pursuit of self-transcendence values. Now, here's another circumplex. This one comes from the work that Fred Grouzet and I did. There are some differences between our circumplex and Schwartz's, but I want to focus today on what's similar. So these values here that I just circled in red are what we call the extrinsic values. These are for popularity, image, and financial success. Here are some of the specific items which we use to assess extrinsic goals or values. And these are values which concern trying, again, to get extrinsic rewards, to have other people give us social praise, etc. So they're like those self-enhancing values. And again, you can see that popularity, image, and financial success cluster together. And this makes sense. You know, think about somebody who cares about image. Well, in order to care about image, you need to buy stuff usually, like clothes and handbags and cars, okay? And oftentimes you want to care about your image in order to be popular. So that's the compatibility of these three sets of values. Now, these stand in opposition to what we call the intrinsic values. These are basically like Schwartz's self-transcendence values. These concern values for affiliation, which is like Schwartz's benevolence, community feeling, which is like Schwartz's universalism, and then also the goal of self-acceptance, which concerns growing as a person and being who it is that you want to be and pursuing your own interests. I want to note that in this particular analysis, we actually statistically were placing values on the 360 degrees of the circle. And so what this means is that perfect opposition between values would be represented by 180 degrees of opposition between the dots you see up there. The dot of financial success and the dot of community feeling are 192 degrees opposed. It's difficult to simultaneously be greedy and generous. Okay? That's what that represents. Okay, so why does this matter? Why should you care? Well, there's at least two different applications of this work to the work that environmentalists do. The first has to do with what we'll call personal dispositions. And my bet is that this is the way you've been thinking about values the whole time you've been listening to me so far. So when we talk about at the dispositional level, what we mean is that there's this person who cares about this value, and he cares about it today, and he cares about it tomorrow, and he'll care about it 5 years from now. So what I'd like you to do just for right now is to think about somebody you know who cares a lot about achievement and being really successful. Now I'd like you to think about somebody you know who cares a lot about power and influencing other people, and being in charge, and having high social status. And now I'd like you to think about somebody you know who really cares a lot about trying to make the world a better place and improving the quality of the world. Now, is everybody able to bring somebody to mind for all of those different kinds of values? Okay, so that shows the dispositional level. You have this idea that this person is dispositionally disposed to make choices that these kinds of things are important, and then I'll pursue them. Now, what we know from a variety of different kinds of research is that people who have a high disposition to care about the self-enhancing and extrinsic values for money, image, status, and power tend to engage in worse environmental behavior and have worse environmental attitudes, whereas people who care about intrinsic and self-transcendent values tend to have more positive environmental attitudes and behaviors. And I'm going to tell you about a little bit of that research right now. So, for example, with regard to ecological attitudes, if you just straightforwardly measure things like how much people agree with statements like, I care about the health of the environment, I consider myself an environmentalist, I think it's important to protect the earth for future generations, people who are extrinsically oriented are less likely to agree with those statements. Whereas people who are more intrinsically oriented are likely to agree that the environment and the rest are important. We also know that these values are associated with the concern that people have about the environment. So in one questionnaire, what they do is they say, well, a lot of people are worried about environmental damage. Why are you worried? Are you worried because you're worried about how it'll affect people in poor countries that tend to be low-lying? Are you worried about how it'll affect future generations? Are you worried about how it'll affect other species? Are you worried how it'll affect you? And what the research shows is that to the extent an extrinsically oriented person cares about environmental damage, it's largely because they're worried that their beach house is going to go underwater as hurricanes come in. But to the extent that if intrinsically oriented people, when they're concerned about the environment, not to say they're not concerned about how it'll affect them, but they're more likely to say that they're also concerned about how it'll affect other species, other generations, and poorer people. We also know that these values are associated with actual behaviors in which people engage. So in this study, Ken Sheldon and Holly McGregor brought people into the lab and measured their values, whether they were intrinsically or extrinsically oriented. And then they had them play a game where they had to manage a state forest. And everybody was pretending that they were a timber company, and they had to bid against each other to harvest wood from this forest. And the game played out over 20 years, okay, in the lab. And what Sheldon and McGregor found was that the more that there were extrinsically oriented people in the group, the less likely there was to be a forest to play with at 20 years. They used up their whole forest. Whereas intrinsically oriented groups were more likely to be able to keep the forest going. They were more sustainable. We also know that intrinsic versus extrinsic orientations are associated with a lot of those kind of simple behaviors like riding a bike, recycling, using both sides of the paper, turning the lights off in rooms that nobody's sitting in, etc. This has been shown over and over again. And other studies have shown that the size of our ecological footprints, which is, how many of you know the term ecological footprint? I've been asking this question for 15 years, and you can't believe what a pleasure it is to see so many hands go up. Because when I used to ask this question 15 years ago, maybe 2 hands would go up in an audience this size. So it's really a meme which has entered people's ideas and people's world. So that's great. For those of you who don't know or who need a refresher, your ecological footprint is largely made up of your food choices, your transportation choices, and your housing choices. So you have a big ecological footprint if you eat a lot of meat, if you eat a lot of out-of-season vegetables and fruits, if you fly a lot or drive gas-guzzling cars, or if you live in big houses that require a lot of energy to heat or cool them or to build them, okay? Kirk Brown and I found that intrinsically oriented people have significantly lower ecological footprints than do extrinsically oriented people. Actually, we just last year, if any of you know what a meta-analysis is, that's where you can combine effects across a variety of different studies. And we just published a meta-analysis on the relationship between materialism or extrinsic values and ecological outcomes last year. It's probably too small for you to see. but what we found was a consistent negative relationship between people's materialistic values and, interestingly, both their ecological attitudes and behaviors. Okay? So it's not just affecting attitudes, it also seems to be related to people's behaviors. Okay, so here's the second way in which these values and goals are related, are important, I think, for environmentalists. And this has to do with the activation of values. So let's go back to our pie chart here. What the idea is that all of us actually have all of these values. All of us care to some extent about all of these things. So now I'm going to ask you to do a second thing. Now I would like you to think about the last 2 weeks of your own life. And I'd like you to bring to mind a time when you cared a lot about your family and friends. And now I'd like you to bring to mind a time when you cared a lot about the state of the world, or polar bears, or people in some other foreign country. And now, although it may be uncomfortable, I'd like you to bring to mind a time when you were very achievement-oriented and focused on your own success and attaining some power. Now, if you're like me, and just to feel better, now think about a hedonistic time, okay? So if you're like me, you can think about all of these things because all of these values exist within all of us. And what happens is that sometimes we're pursuing one set of values and we do that for a while, but then something changes and now we're pursuing this other value, and then something changes and now we're pursuing a different value, okay? And this happens in part because different values get activated, okay? They get activated. So just for example, if I were to say the word mother, a whole bunch of different ideas about mothers got activated in your mind. If I were to do certain things in your environment that made you think, so all the students in here, if it was midterms time, those achievement orientations are going to become much more activated for you right now than on a Saturday night. Okay? Now, here's the issue. Because of the way that the circumplex is organized, that is, because of the way that values are organized in your mind, activation of one value actually has two very interesting effects. The first effect is what we call the bleed-over effect, and the second is what we call the suppression or the seesaw effect. So the bleed-over effect means this. If I get you thinking about universalism values, you're also actually going to start thinking about benevolence values. So what happens is that your value concern bleeds over into similar compatible values. But there's also a seesaw or a suppression effect, whereby if I get you to think about universalism values, that's actually going to suppress your achievement and power values, because those values stand in conflict to each other. And what I'd like to do now is to show you some data relevant to that claim. So this is a study that Ken Sheldon and I did at the University of Missouri a couple of years ago. And what we did in this study was we brought students at Mizzou into the lab, and we assigned them to one of 5 conditions. So they either thought about what it was like to be a human, what it was like to be a Missouri student, what it was like to be an American, and then there were 2 more American conditions. One of the American conditions was, think about an American, and we reminded them that America is the place where you can come and you can go to Hollywood and you can become really rich and famous and everybody will know who you are and you'll be fabulous. So we activated an extrinsic American identity. Or we activated an intrinsic American identity. We reminded them that America is a place that cares deeply about freedom and personal choice, that family values are very important in America, and that America has a long history of trying to help other countries. So we activated intrinsic values. What I want to emphasize is we never mentioned the environment. We never mentioned the environment at all. Now, then what we did is we said, imagine that the president has asked you to sit on a panel that is going to make recommendations for policy with regard to what Americans' environmentally related behavior should be. And essentially what we did was we gave them an ecological footprint questionnaire, and we asked questions like, what should the average American's car gas mileage be? How often would the average American eat meat? How big would the average American's house be? Okay? So we got a sense, essentially, of what their proposal was for how big the average American's ecological footprint would be. Everybody with me? Here's what we found. There's two interesting things in this. The middle bar is what happened, is the footprints, recommended footprints of the people primed with an intrinsic American identity. Just by reminding people that America is a land that can pursue intrinsic values, they recommended significantly lower, significantly more sustainable ecological footprints than any other group. We hadn't mentioned the environment at all. But by activating those intrinsic values, there was a bleed-over effect so that those other values that have to do with the environment also got activated. There probably was also a suppression effect, because by activating the intrinsic values, we would have suppressed those values about money and consumption. And obviously, usually when we're damaging the environment, a lot of it is by consuming. So we suppressed those, which also would make people say, oh, consume less. Here, to me, is the more scary finding. The group that recommended the highest ecological footprints had just been primed with American identity. There's something about, at least in University of Missouri students, which makes them, when they think about being an American, actually recommend the least sustainable options for the future. Now, America is the land of consumption and capitalism. Here's another study. This one was done by Greg Mayo. So what Greg did was he brought students in and he had them complete a survey about car sharing. Okay? Now, half of the students were asked to think about car sharing, that the reason you would car share is because it saves money. Okay? You don't have to pay for your own car. You get to, split the expenses over a variety of people. The other half were asked to think about car sharing as protecting the environment. It's good to car share because then there's fewer cars on the street, people are driving less, etc. So he primed the extrinsic goals of money or the intrinsic universalism goals of the environment. Then what he did was he said, we want you to design a logo for the university car sharing program. Here's some pieces of paper and pencils. Draw us out some logos. So for the next 5 minutes, the students sat there and they're like drawing on these pieces of paper. And then the experimenter returns and says, okay, we're done for now. We're going to go to another lab, get rid of your pieces of paper, and come with me. Now, here's a picture of the lab. And it's pretty faded out given the light in here, but there's a garbage can and there's a recycling bin. So the question was, where would they put their paper? People who had just been primed to think about environmental reasons for car sharing recycled more. People who had just been primed to think about monetary reasons for car sharing recycled less. And they recycled less than the control group, too. By activating those intrinsic self-transcendent goals, there was a bleed-over effect such that now they cared about recycling, too. And there was a suppression effect such that they probably cared more about those extrinsic things and therefore were less likely to end up engaging in a new pro-environmental behavior. Here's another study by Martin van Steenkies. This study is done with students in Belgium. They're all education students. They're students who are studying to become teachers. Okay? And he gave them a text on recycling. Okay? So everybody read the same thing about recycling. Half of them were told, the reason when you become a teacher you should recycle is because it'll help the community. It'll be something which is good for the community where you're teaching. The other half were told that the reason that you should recycle, and encourage recycling when you're a teacher is because it'll actually save your school district money, and that's important. I want to note this was about a 30-second intervention. Okay? It's about a 30-second intervention. 2 weeks later, they looked at the difference between people given an extrinsic frame versus an intrinsic frame for recycling. They gave them a test about recycling, and the people in the intrinsic group did better on the test. They learned more about recycling. Why? This, to me, is these next two is really, just shows really great experimental design. What they did was they put a reserve in the library on recycling, and they got the librarians to keep track of who came and checked it out. And they found that those who were given an intrinsic frame were more likely to visit the library and check out the article that was on reserve. Furthermore, they gave all the students the opportunity to go on a field trip to a recycling plant, and the ones who had it intrinsically framed were more likely to sign up and go on the field trip. Just by this 30-second intervention. Okay, let me talk about the implications of this. And there are a lot of implications. I'm just going to talk about 3 sets of them. The first one has to do with what's called iatrogenic effects. The term of an iatrogen comes from the medical literature. An iatrogenic effect is when, let's say that I'm trying to help your heart, and I'm a doctor, and I prescribe a medicine, but it actually raises your blood pressure and causes you more heart damage. That's an iatrogenic effect. I was trying to treat you, but I actually made you worse. Okay? Now, environmentalists, in my mind, and this is one of the major critiques Tom and I have made of environmentalists over the years, is that environmentalists have capitulated to the broad consumeristic capitalistic countries in which they exist and have largely tried to convince people that the reason to be green is because it saves money or because it will help you to look cool or you can be a green consumer or that there's a business case for sustainability. What I hope you see is that in every single one of those cases, extrinsic goals are being activated. Okay? Extrinsic goals are being activated there. There's also another, and I think I have time to talk about this, there's also another, I think, very problematic viewpoint here. So there's a lot of research out there on fees for ecosystem services. So, for example, bees are worth $6 billion or something like that to the agriculture industry because they fly around and they pollinate stuff, right? And therefore, environmentalists argue, well, we got to help the bees because they're worth $6 billion to the agricultural industry. Okay, fine. Let's say that there's some other species that's only worth $10,000 to the economy. What environmentalists have just taught the public is we should let that species go extinct because they're only worth $10,000. We should keep species that are worth something for the economy, but those other ones, why bother? Why? Because they've taught people to think that what's important is extrinsic values. They've modeled the value of money, power, and such. And they've also activated those values. Now, when Tom and I first started writing this work, we were subjected to literal attack in the press from certain marketers who had spent much of their career arguing for the business case for sustainability and looking cool and green consumerism and all the rest. And they said, look, this is never going to work what Crompton and Kasser are proposing because there are extrinsically oriented people out there who just care about money and status and image, and they're not going to be affected by this. It's not going to work for those people. So being scientists, we decided to test that hypothesis. So what we did was we collaborated with a linguist and some psychologists in Wales, and we pre-screened 700 adults in the United Kingdom, and we gave them all the Schwartz Values Survey. And we picked the 30 people who scored really high in self-enhancing values. So these were all people who were the highest in terms of saying, you know what's important to me? Money, power, achievement, status. Those were the only people in our study. Really self-enhancing people. And they came to the lab, and what we did was we primed them with either intrinsic or extrinsic goals. So half of them wrote about why popularity, image, and wealth were important, and the other half wrote about why acceptance, affiliation, and being broad-minded were important. Again, I want to note, we did not mention the environment at all. Then what we did was all of them underwent a standardized interview. on 4 topics: climate change, the loss of countryside in the UK, it's an island, so there's a lot getting lost, child mortality in developing nations, and poverty among UK children. So they were interviewed about this, and a linguist read through all of those interviews. And the linguist was blind to what the purpose of the study was blind to what the primes had been, just read all of these interviews. And he coded them on a lot of variety of things. So the first thing I'll talk about was whether or not the person was saying somebody should do something about these problems or don't bother. Now again, I want to remind you, these are all very extrinsically oriented people, and we know that dispositionally they don't care about this stuff so much. But what we found, and this is kind of faded out again, was a significant effect such that extrinsically oriented people who had been primed with intrinsic values were more likely to say somebody should do something about this problem than extrinsically oriented people primed with extrinsic values. Similarly, if we looked at, well, maybe why are they saying you should do something? Is it because I'm going to lose my beach house? Or is it because we need to do something to fix this problem to help other people? And again, extrinsically oriented people primed with intrinsic values were significantly more likely to say we should do this because we need to help the world rather than we need to help me. I'm going to show you 2 quotes to illustrate this. These are 2 different people, both of whom are extrinsic dispositionally. They care about money, status, power, or achievement. But one has been primed with extrinsic goals. And when asked about climate change, this person says, what would motivate me? I suppose money if there was a financial incentive to be more proactive. I do tend to switch things off, but that's more of a case of me saving money and electricity than thinking, oh, that's going to help the world. Very explicit. I'm doing this for these extrinsic reasons, not for this intrinsic reason. Now here's an equally extrinsic person primed with intrinsic goals. I do think that the earth and the environment is precious and valuable. I think it should be at the top of the political agenda. I think that the world that we pass on to the next generation, is our responsibility. Took a while to get it out, but they were able to say something that was about universalism values. So what I want to emphasize here is that it can be I understand why environmentalists think that we need to continually appeal to extrinsic values. But what I hope I've shown you so far is the danger in that, and also the hope in appealing to intrinsic values. That there is hope in doing that, even for what some might call the hardcore extrinsic person. Here's a second implication for environmentalists. It's this. So the work that Tom and I have done is now called the common cause work by and large. And the reason we call it the common cause work is because we recognize that there's no chance to win the battle of values if just environmentalists are doing it. It's too big. Okay? What we need to do is to join forces with other people who also recognize the importance of intrinsic and self-transcendent values and why extrinsic and self-enhancing values are problematic. Now, there's a lot of data on this. So, for example, in the very early days of my research and what the high price of materialism is about why it is that people who are focused on extrinsic values are less happy. So since that initial research 20 years ago, there have literally now been dozens of studies that show that in different nations, in different age groups, in business people, with lots of ways of assessing the variables, that the more people care about extrinsic values, the less happy they are. Here's a meta-analysis, again, that we hope is going to be accepted for publication very soon. And what this shows is that the more that people are focused on extrinsic goals, the less satisfied they are with their life across 41 different studies. The more they experience unpleasant affect across 30 studies. The less they experience positive affect, so joy, over 44 studies. The more they like themselves. The more extrinsic people are, the more anxious they are, the more depressed they are, the worse their health. It's a very consistent finding that happens across lots of different areas. Now, there are people out there who, frankly, don't give a damn about the environment, but who care a lot about trying to improve people's well-being. If we can join forces with them and say, the same values that underlie caring about well-being are the same values that care about environmentalism, we have a natural ally. Similarly, there are lots of social problems out there. Lack of democracy, poverty, racism, etc. And we know from the research that intrinsic versus extrinsic values are also associated with these. So extrinsically oriented people score lower in empathy. They don't really care so much about understanding someone else's point of view. Extrinsically oriented people score higher in Machiavellianism. They're happy to manipulate other people for their own ends. Extrinsically oriented people score higher in racial and ethnic prejudice. They believe people of other races and ethnicities are worse than they are. They score higher in social dominance orientation, which essentially is the belief that my group is better than yours, and the reason your group isn't doing so well in the world is because you're lazy or stupid. We also have found that this is associated with social behavior. Numerous studies showing that extrinsically oriented people engage in less pro-social behavior, like sharing and helping, more antisocial behavior, like cheating and lying, and actually more antisocial business behavior as well. And also, extrinsic versus intrinsic orientations influence whether we cooperate or compete. Again, a lot of people who care a lot about racism or ethnic problems or empathy development who maybe don't care about the environment. But the same values that influence environmental attitudes are the same values which influence well-being, are the same values which influence social well-being. So there's natural allies. The final implication I'll talk about has to do with working to diminish the causes of extrinsic self-enhancing values and also to encourage intrinsic and self-transcendent values. Now, I could talk for hours about that. I won't. But I just want to talk about one set of causes of extrinsic and self-enhancing values, which is social modeling. The more we see these values in our environment, the more likely we are to imitate those values. So we know that the more our friends, our parents, or our peers care about extrinsic values, the more that people do who are around those people. We know that the more people watch television, the more they're exposed to commercials, the more they're exposed to advertising, their extrinsic values go up. This is all empirically documented. I don't have the citations up. We also know from 2 studies that living in a nation like the United States and the United Kingdom that has organized its economy in a highly neoliberal, deregulated, free market fashion, the citizens of those nations have higher extrinsic self-enhancing values and lower intrinsic self-transcendent values than nations which have other forms of capitalism, which are less free market, less neoliberal, more regulated. So there's hundreds of things we could do around this way. One thing that's very popular, increasingly popular, is adopting alternative indicators. Right now, the major indicators are about how's the economy doing, which is all about privileging economic growth, which is all about materialistic values. These alternative indicators, like gross national happiness from Bhutan or the genuine progress indicator or happiness indicators, say, you know what? That's not all that's important for determining whether a nation, a state, or a city, or actually a college is doing well. There are some people who have developed these college-level indicators too. Instead, what's important are other things like relationships and volunteering and how we're doing sustainability-wise, etc. And let's measure those and feed those back. Imagine, if you will, that just as often as you heard about how the Dow Jones was doing and the Consumer Confidence Index was doing, that you heard how many species were going extinct this year, that you heard how many people were depressed this year, you would get a very different message from the media and from politicians as to what's important. A very different set of values would be modeled. A second thing we could do has to do with campaigns regarding advertising. I've sit on the board of the Campaign for a Commercial-Free Childhood. We've been working for many years to ban advertising to children, because children really can't understand advertising like we do. Banning advertising in public spaces. You know, when I open up a magazine, I expect to see an ad. When I go for a walk in a publicly funded place, I don't expect for my tax dollars to subsidize some company who wants to tell me about Coca-Cola. Some countries have gotten rid of ads in public spaces. Right now, you may not know this, but all money that a company spends on advertising is actually a tax break. So you know when you fill out your taxes and you get to write off all the money you gave to charity? A company gets to write off all the money it spent on advertising. I would propose that we have a form of tax called value pollution, and we stop that tax break and we instead tax it just like we tax other companies who put other pollutants into the air. We also, I think, need to reduce corporate power. Let's face it, a large reason why right now we have the kind of economy we do is because, especially since the Citizens United decision, we have a variety of different kinds of issues whereby corporations whose a publicly traded corporation by law has one and only one purpose, which is to maximize shareholder value. No other purpose. And the more the corporations have power, the more that becomes the driving force behind our government. And so so we need other forms of corporations. If you haven't heard of benefit corporations, really fantastic. When they charter that they both maximize shareholder for their shareholder value, but they also have to consider the good of the community in which they live. And they have to balance both of those as they make decisions. Think about that as a different way forward for business. Revising campaign finance laws would also be worthwhile if we could get there. What I hope I've done today is to show you that attention to human identity might have some beneficial impacts for thinking about how to make progress on environmental kinds of issues. I hope you've seen that this work has some important implications at both the disposition and at the activation level for environmentalists, and they include bewaring these iatrogenic effects, forming some coalitions, and discouraging the damaging identities like extrinsic ones and encouraging the helpful intrinsic ones. I thank you for your attention. So, how are we doing questions here? Do we have some?
Yes.
Oh, wow, okay. She gave me a look that suggested that there are either a lot or challenging ones.
There's a lot of questions.
Okay.
Feel free to keep asking. You can add them to the poll. There will also be a member from our department, Dan over there in the orange sweatshirt, who will be walking around with an iPad if you don't have a phone or internet access. So you can ask your questions that way as well. Just flag them down. More just keep coming in. Okay. So the first question is, it appeared that in the values and goals area, openness to change and conservation are a little larger. Could you speak to their part in sustainable behavior?
Okay, so I always get questions about the circumplex, so I always just put them at the end of my slide after the thank you slide, so it's easy to get to them. So what we're talking about here is the other dimension of openness to change versus conservation, all right? So I mostly talked about self-enhancement versus self-transcendent. The reason I didn't really talk about openness to change versus conservation is thus far the research suggests that there's really not a whole lot of action there. Okay? There's not a whole lot of action there at the dispositional level in terms of how those values relate to environmental attitudes or environmental behaviors, and there's not a whole lot of action there at the activation level. So activating the openness or the conservation values, thus far, there doesn't seem to be a lot that influences people's attitudes. That said, there's some interesting theoretical work out there which suggests the possibility. So if we go on the due east part of the circumplex where conformity and tradition are, there's some work that, again, purely theoretical at this point, that suggests that perhaps among politically conservative people, activating conformity and tradition values, because it sits next to benevolence, might be able to promote environmental outcomes, especially because, let's face it, that part of tradition is keeping that park that has been there in the public square for 200 years, keeping that tree, which is a centerpiece of the college, etc. And so there's some interesting work at that level suggesting, well, if you can tie nature in at that tradition level, because it's still consistent, relatively speaking, with self-transcendence, you might be able to have some beneficial environmental outcomes. To my knowledge, still no empirical data to support that, but definitely worth testing.
Next question is, what would you recommend as the best ways to reach people with more extrinsic values?
Yeah, here's the thing, is that, and I've had this conversation with a lot of folks over the years. I know it's really, and I've been so guilty of this, especially early in my career. It's really easy to kind of stereotype and have prejudice against people who we think are extrinsically oriented at a dispositional level. And I will acknowledge that there probably is some percentage of the population, research to my knowledge suggests that maybe about 3 to 5% of the population might just be really psychopaths. And that reaching them around intrinsic values and goals may not ever be successful. And I can grant that. But that's only 3 or so % of the population. There's a lot of other people out there who are extrinsically oriented in some respects, or at least appear to be. But I would remind you that we all have all of those values, except maybe the psychopaths. We all have all of those values. And they are there to be activated. They are there to be encouraged. They are there to be talked about. Now, you might have to talk about the intrinsic value of community feeling with an extrinsically oriented person different than how you talk about it with an intrinsically oriented person. In fact, I'm sure you would have to. I can't tell you exactly how to do that. That's the cutting edge of where we're at, okay? But I have no doubt that needs to be done. But my experience over and over again is that when you sit down and you talk with a person who seems like they really care mostly about money, there's a way to reach them around these intrinsic values. And the Chilton et al. Study showed that, okay? The study where we primed those really extrinsically oriented people. So I would say the first step is actually just to get beyond your own stereotypes and your own prejudices about what a CEO is or what somebody who's a millionaire is, and recognize that they probably care about their grandkids too, and figure out a way to reach them around those values.
Next question, do you think humans will ever transcend the use/worship of money?
No. I don't, because I think that these extrinsic self-enhancing values are a very basic part of what it means to be human. I think the data suggests that. The historical record supports it. I think that there were very good evolutionary reasons why we became oriented in that way. We're not very fast. We're not very big. Our senses aren't very good. But we were smart enough to figure out how to use a stone or a piece of wood in order to protect ourselves, and how to turn it into a hoe so we could garden. We are here today because we're great tool users, and because we are very excellent manipulators of the material world. And money is partly a reflection of that. We're also primates, and primates are about status hierarchies. And it's going to be very difficult to overcome that. Here's what I would suggest. We have a culture, however, right now that does everything, this is an overstatement, who does a great deal in order to encourage those extrinsic self-enhancing values, who raises those to the good, who says that what's important is economic growth and profit and making money and your status. How many of you have seen the Cadillac commercial on the Olympics about the guy who says, I'll give up, I'll only work 2 weeks of vacation if I can have a Cadillac? That's what our culture encourages us to do. And so what I think we can do, what we can change is to have a culture that instead of celebrating money and extrinsic values, says that it has its place. But its place is a small part of the pie of what's important of life.
This kind of goes along with what you're saying. Is there really such a problem with commercialism and mass consumerism? It's what drives an economy.
It's what drives an economy as currently conceived. okay? Because the economy as currently conceived is a certain kind of economy. There are different ways of organizing economies than the one we have. What we have is a consumer capitalist society, okay? That's our economy. And I totally agree. If we were to get rid of consumerism and decrease extrinsic goals and follow many of the recommendations which I've made today, it would hurt the economy as currently conceived. But let's face it, the economy as currently conceived is going to destroy this earth. All the evidence suggests that. All the evidence suggests, if you look at those graphs that parallel economic growth with biodiversity loss, with dams being put up, with carbon emissions, with every single indicator you can see, as economic growth increases, so does environmental damage. So we cannot continue. We need this economy to be damaged, would be my view. Now, I understand that there are a lot of people out there hurting with jobs and such like that. Don't get me wrong. We need to but that's also part of the way our economy works. It's a winner-take-all economy. And so what we need is a different sort of economy. And there's a lot of economists working on figuring out a slow-growth economy, a lot of economists working on figuring out ways to more equitably distribute the proceeds from our economy. But we just can't go on, as Herman Daly taught us, we can't go on a finite planet looking for infinite growth. We need to change our economy.
Next question. Can you briefly discuss ways to creatively prime people using advertising? For example, using a sign near a recycling bin that primes someone for intrinsic, it cuts off, but my guess is that more for intrinsic values.
Yeah. Well, first off, I would want to not call that advertising. To me, the definition of advertising is when somebody is trying to put forth a message in order to make a profit off of you. Okay? So I wouldn't want to call this advertising. I don't know what the right word is, but I wouldn't want to use that. Actually, there was a study done, this isn't published yet, but up at the University of Ottawa, some people applied these ideas, and they put ads priming intrinsic values or other kinds of things in kind of the campus coffee shop area. And then they followed up to see how many of the people ended up buying recyclable mugs to put their coffee in. And they found that there was an increase in purchase of those mugs and a decrease in the use of the throwaway mugs. Okay? Now, you could do that over and over again. Now, I don't want to turn this into, some follow the 5-year plan kind of, economy either, but I think that there are a lot of creative ways where you can remind people of values as they go around their lives. And let's face it, the research suggests that the average American is exposed to something like 3,000 commercial impressions a day. That's 3,000 times when you're primed with extrinsic values. So let's figure out ways on your smartphones or in the restrooms or wherever else it is or in the campus coffee shop and all the rest where intrinsic values can be primed. And let's also figure out ways that when we communicate and we talk to people about why they're doing what they're doing, be it environmental or not, that we're framing this in an intrinsic way. For example, are you going to college in order to become wealthy, or are you going to college to learn? That's a very different set of primes.
Sometimes people's stated values don't often line up with their typical behavior. How does this play out in your research?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it really gets to the crux of a lot of it. So there is definitely a gap between it's called the attitude-behavior gap, or the value-behavior gap. And the correlations between people's values and their behaviors is far from perfect, okay? It's there, but it's far from perfect. The thing is that, and Arlen and I were talking about this earlier today, actually, there are dozens of things which influence why you do a specific thing at a specific time, okay? And values are only one of them. And so to the extent that your values are on your mind and raised kind of in importance or in kind of your conscious awareness, then you're going to be more likely to behave in a value-consistent way. But to the extent that your values are suppressed and instead you're getting hit with these kind of commercial impressions and you've got your friends who are doing X, Y, and Z and there's peer pressure to behave in this other way, then you're going to see a decline in the correlation between values and behavior. Okay? And this is why I think it's so important to realize that the issue is not just to change people's values. The issue is to create a society and create an environment and to create a culture whereby it's easy to pursue intrinsic values and relatively hard to pursue extrinsic values. And then people can engage in ways that are more consistent with those intrinsic values. Again, right now we've created a society that makes it really easy, relatively speaking, to focus on extrinsic goals. Imagine we create a society that makes it relatively easy to focus on intrinsic goals. Then you're going to find that there's less of that gap. I actually think that this is part of why we have as much depression and anxiety in people's lives as we do in America today, because the research shows actually that most people say that intrinsic values are more important to them than extrinsic values. But if we live in a society where it's hard to pursue intrinsic values, you're not going to be very happy. And so what we need, again, is to create a society that makes that easier. Just like we need bike lanes. That's the analogy. If people want to ride their bikes, but the only way to do that is to have big trucks driving by them 6 inches from them, they're not going to ride their bikes, right? If people want to walk on a sidewalk, but there's no sidewalk and they got to go through 6 feet of snow, they're not going to walk. You've got to create a society which lets people, which affords the opportunity to make it easier to pursue these kinds of pursuits.
How long generally will a primed value persist?
We don't know the answer to that, but I would remind you of the Van Steenkiest et al. Study, which showed that it persisted 2 weeks, at least. That's, to my knowledge, the longest effect that I've seen from a primed value. I think that the real question to me, I think that's a good question, but the question I think really needs to be explored is, what happens when you continually prime some values? So again, if you get 3,000 commercial impressions a day, that means you're every, I don't know how many seconds, maybe getting some repeated primes. I'd be really curious to know what happens if you get repeated primes of intrinsic values. And that should really have a stronger effect than just one 5-second prime, okay? So I would say open for empirical scrutiny. I hope people study it.
What do you know about the Venus Project and or the Disclosure Project?
Nothing.
Okay. So I have a question that's half cut off, but hopefully you can speak a little bit towards this. It says,
Okay.
A common definition of sustainability involves the need to simultaneously address economic, social, and environmental issues. And then ask something about the definition.
Sure. Well, I'm going to guess that it has something to do with how this connects with values. Is the person who asked that question still here? Well, okay. I would say that I don't disagree with that. That we need both economic and social and environmental sustainability. I think that the problem today is that even though what they call it, the 3 pillars or the 3 legs of a stool, that's the metaphor you hear. Those are the 3 legs of the stool of sustainability. The stool's one leg is way bigger than the other one in the way that common practice currently happens. I see the Director of Sustainability laughing there, okay? But I think you've definitely got one leg which gets way more attention than the other one and which is privileged. And I think that shows the value orientation, but it also shows the dynamics of the culture that we live in and the pressure that power makers are under, or decision makers are under sometimes.
Okay, I know you spoke a little bit about this at the end of your presentation, but maybe in more detail. It says, how does one go about changing a system rooted in greed and corruption, which is centuries in the making? Basically, how do you wake up the masses? How do we wake up the masses?
Right. Well, here's what I'll say. I think the first thing is you have to figure out how to live your own life. And you've got to live your own life with as much integrity as you can. And you have to, Cecile Andrews once said to me, Tim, the only way we're going to win is if we show them that our way is more fun. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. And I think evident that the research that I showed you actually shows that organizing your life around intrinsic values is more fun. People are happier. They're less upset. And so I think, what we need are models from all of us about how to live our lives in a more sustainable way, in a more intrinsically oriented way. And doing that means something. It does mean something. But I think we also have to have political action. And I think we also, and by that I mean not just at the federal level. I feel like far too often in this day and age we think that everything should be solved by Washington. But you know what? Political action can happen at IIT. I've been involved in political action in my own college in order to make policy, political, the root of political is policies. And your policies, you've got policies at IIT, you've got policies in Chicago, you've got policies in Illinois, and we've got policies at the federal level. And we need to work and pick the policy that you care about the most. If you try to take on all the policies that need to be changed, you're going to be burnt out in 3 years, is my prediction. Find the policies that you care about and that you want to work on. And work and find some people who want to work with you and make some changes to those policies. And then if you lose, learn from it. If you win, celebrate, and then go on to the next policy. And the next one, and the next one. It's really easy to listen to all of the environmental doom and gloom, and if we don't change by 2050, forget it. And maybe they're right, and maybe they're wrong. I don't really know, okay? But all I know is that all of these efforts for quick fixes have failed so far. And if we keep trying for the big quick fix, I think we're not going to do much. But I think if we keep steady on making the policy changes we can at various institutions, it's going to build up, and it's going to build up, and then the masses, if you will come our way because they'll see that this is more fun and this also makes sense and it's doable. So it's both. It's both your individual life and your political action.
Last question, unless any other ones come in last minute. Two just came in. What types of things have you done personally to increase relative amount of intrinsic priming that you receive?
Me personally?
Yes.
I haven't watched TV in a long, long time. I mean, I watch it like if I'm in a hotel or something like that, but I don't watch television at home. I use ad block on the internet. I have a commute that has no ads, I think, along the way. I have set up I live out in the country. I spend a lot of time outside. I spend a lot of time playing games with my family. I play the piano and sing basically every day. I made an agreement with the people that I work with at my job that I teach at a 2/3 or a 3/4 level, and that's all I get paid, so that I can spend my time writing and doing activism and being with my family and playing the piano. And I sit on the board of 2 different organizations, one of which is organized to decrease access of marketers to children, and the other one, Center for a New American Dream, which is focused on basically showing that the intrinsic way is more fun, developing a sharing economy, helping people to get away from money and consumerism in their lives. Those would be some of and I married a woman who supports all that and who pushes me to live with better integrity as well.
Last question. Is it easier to transition intrinsic values to extrinsic or vice versa? Is this part of the problem in today's society?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by transition, but if you mean like to activate or to get people to kind of push forward on, I'm ambivalent. I think there's evidence both ways. On the one hand, as I mentioned before, intrinsic values do tend to be more highly valued by most people, and there's some evidence that most people, upon reflection, will be able to say, yeah, intrinsic values are what I care about. On the other hand, one of the other major causes of people orienting towards extrinsic values is insecurity and threat. And when people are under feelings of threat, and there are dozens of studies now showing this, they give up on intrinsic values and they move towards extrinsic values. And there's lots of threats in our world over and over and over again. And so I think there's something really powerful and tempting about extrinsic and self-enhancing values. I think there's something, this is why every religion has had to talk about them, has had to deal with them somehow. They're in us, And there's a pull there. There's a real pull there. I know it in my own life. And so I think they each are powerful, but powerful in really different ways. And I hope that's not seen as ducking your question. I think that they have really different ways of being activated and of influencing us. So that was the last question, is that right? I thank you so much for coming and for sticking to the questions.